Well, good morning, everyone, and we're delighted that you have joined the Detroit Regional Chamber today for what is going to be a fabulous and informative discussion about the situation with the UAW and the Detroit 3 automakers. With us today is John McElroy of Autoline. John has been covering the auto industry for a lot longer than I think he is willing to admit. He is the host of the award-winning Autoline and one of the most respected voices in the automotive industry. And he's also a former UAW member working at one of the Ford facilities. And I think we're going to get into that as we discuss today. Also joining us today is Professor Marick Masters, Professor of Management at the Mike Ilitch School of Business at Wayne State University. Professor Masters is a nationally recognized expert on labor management relations and at the intersection of business, labor, and politics, all very relevant to our discussion today. And the Chamber is so pleased to have Professor Masters today, as I don't think anyone is in more demand by the media today to opine on what is happening in our business community today. And also joining is my friend and my colleague, Glenn Stevens Jr. Glenn is Vice President of Mobility Initiatives here at the Detroit Regional Chamber. He is also the Executive Director of MICHauto, Michigan's statewide automotive and mobility industry cluster association. So gentlemen, thank you so much for joining today. Just a quick housekeeping note. We have somewhere between 250 and 300 people who are joining our conversation today. Other than our panelists, everyone is muted and off camera. And while we have a lot to cover, I will be keeping an eye on the Q&A section. So if you look at the top of your screen, you should see a little icon that says Q&A. If you have a question or a comment, please use the Q&A button, and I will do the best I can to weave those comments or those questions into the conversation with our three expert panelists. And we also strive for a free-flowing discussion today. So while I might direct a question to Glenn, we want everyone to participate and get a full discussion. So with that, let me start with a really basic question, gentlemen. Do the UAW workers deserve a raise? And John, you're the former UAW member. I'm going to start with you on that one.
You bet they deserve a raise, and more than just a raise. I think that their profit sharing should be sweetened up. I agree that the tiers should largely be eliminated. They need inflation protection. It looks like Ford's already caved on COLA. They're going to get that. Ford's already said it's going to eliminate all the tiers. So the union's made huge progress on that. I think that their retirement benefits can be sweetened up. There's a lot that they can get, and I think they deserve to get it.
Right. Professor Masters?
I believe that they deserve to get substantial increases in their wages and other payments that will make them richer. But that there are certain other issues which are really untenable, and that's why we're in the difficulty that we are today.
And Glenn, I know you agree with that as well too. Just want to.
I do. Look, labor built this state with the companies, and we've been through these negotiations before, and we'll go through them again. But we're also at a very key time in the industry. So I think them coming together right now with what labor needs to build their lives and what the companies can provide based on their competitiveness on a national or global stage.
Okay, great. So just to get out of the box, that everyone agrees that that sweetening their compensation is the right thing to do. So Professor Masters, can you provide us a highlight of what the UAW's demands are? What are they looking for on the compensation side, but also on the non-compensation side, so we all understand what we're looking at here?
Well, I think their demands fall into two buckets. Those things that deal directly and indirectly with wages. One is a general wage increase. Another is dealing with, in progression, shortening the amount of time it gets to the highest wage rate, which is another way of giving people a wage increase. A third is dealing with the temporary employee issue, transitioning them to full-time employment at a higher wage level. That is all within the bucket of wage increases. Then you've got other issues that deal more with restoration of give back, so to speak, the things that they had to concede in the bankruptcy era, the retiree health care, the defined pension benefit plans, and the jobs bank. There's another issue that's been thrown into the mix, and that is the 4-day work week. All those things together, I think, create a whole ball of wax that leads the companies to say that the demands as they presently stand are unsustainable, untenable. That's the language I hear from them. And that basically deals with the second bucket of items. So I think a deal can be struck if the focus is on the first bucket. And there are lots of ancillary issues and complexities associated with that. But this isn't rocket science. You can see the makings of a deal if the parties are willing to put aside trying to get everything in one fell swoop. But as long as this becomes a contest of economic strength or power to force one side to capitulate, you're going to see a situation that could evolve into an unfortunate development in which there are just losers.
Gotcha. Glenn, can you kind of share where the Detroit 3 are today with the existing contracts versus kind of what the competition out there is in the global automotive and mobility space?
Sure, and the competition today is different than it was 10 or 20 years ago, because we have this little company who's no longer a little company called Tesla in the mix. So I think generally speaking, we see 65, 55, 45. So the Detroit 3 at around $65 an hour when you look at that. The transplants, and this is a big average because there's a lot of them, German, Asian companies, probably at 55, and then Tesla is around 45. And they also have different packages too, right? I mean, Tesla has a stock option plan for some of their workforce too. So that's kind of how it stacks up.
John, what is the what is the average, if you know it, of what a UAW worker takes home today? Obviously, if you listen to the UAW leadership, they're saying it's it's a maybe if not poverty level, it's something not great. Can you put it in perspective in terms of what they're really bringing home?
Yeah, I can. Just give me a second because I have to turn to the specific numbers here. But
No, actually, yeah.
if you look at these numbers come from General Motors, by the way, just so everybody knows. But if you look at total cash, now that includes wages, bonuses, and profit sharing. An in-progress employee, that is somebody that was hired after 2007, is earning $84,000 in cash. A traditional worker, i.e. somebody before 2007, is making about $105,000 in cash, and a skilled trades person is earning about $134,000 in cash. So that's just money. That doesn't include any of the benefits.
So that doesn't include health care or anything else.
Correct. Again, going to the GM numbers, GM says it spends an average of $23,000 on healthcare per UAW employee. But, I want to go back to something that Glenn brought up because I think it's critically important. There are 13 foreign automakers and EV startups operating in the United States. They have built 30 gigantic manufacturing complexes. They make several million cars and trucks and vans in the United States every year. And they employ 128,000 Americans, none of whom are organized by the UAW. And that's the real issue, I think, that's coming up to it. I don't think the Detroit 3 would worry so much of what they're paying in compensation to the union, except that they're stacked up, as Glenn brought up, the wage disparity is gigantic for them. And so one of the key things I think the union's going to have to look at, and we saw a fascinating development yesterday where they struck one of the supplier plants, ZF or ZF, that is going to cripple production at Mercedes-Benz. In fact, it's going to bring it to a screeching halt. But I'm just bringing that up to show I hope the union, and it looks like maybe it's starting to look at the bigger picture of what it has to do, because if the Detroit Three are at a significant disadvantage here, even if they don't get to some of the things that are untenable in their book, as Marick just brought up, this strike could be very, very damaging.
So, Professor Masters, you've been around the block of these UAW negotiations over the years. It's very different this time. Can you opine on the approach that the UAW is taking this time compared to others, and maybe some of the implications, and maybe get into why?
Well, I think the approach is different. In one, it is more militant, it is more ideological, and it is more focused on resorting to tactics to throw the companies off balance. So they're departing from a rather ritualistic process of bargaining that has occurred in the past. The reasons for that lie in the corruption within the union. That forced a change in the leadership, and that enabled, I think, after 70 years of rule by one caucus, an insurgent caucus, to assume a good portion of the leadership roles. They control 7 of the 14 members of the International Executive Board. And that division in and of itself creates some complications because the president is not able to do everything himself that he might want to do, and has to be accountable not only to the rank and file, but the International Executive Board. And I think the longer a strike goes on, the more the accountability levers will be exerted. But that's the basic rub that you have. And the UAW, I think, has done one thing that probably threw the companies off balance a little bit, is that they engaged, as is typical of a more militant and ideological union, and public relations campaign to make this a struggle between good and evil, between the rich and the poor. And that's why they went after the executive compensation. And they cite the 40% increase. And if you look at their situation, just to put it from their perspective a little bit, the average UAW worker made, let's say, $28 an hour in 2007. If you adjust that for inflation, they'd be making about $42 an hour now, which is about a 47% increase. If you look at $32 an hour times the number of hours they might work, let's say 2,080, which is typically used in costing out labor relations contracts, the UAW workers' pay is a little over $66,000. The contract that GM is proposing will raise that pay up to about $82,000. That's not including the payments that John is referring to, the profit sharing payments, the other lump sum payments which go into it. That when the UAW talks about catching up, it looks at its wages since the last contract. They've gone down in auto manufacturing about 20% with inflation. They're saying this is an injustice that needs to be corrected. But I think there's something underlying here which clouds the whole thing and really needs to be raised for a point of discussion. It is the push to electrification. And the companies are between a rock and a hard place. They produce cars now as much to comply with government mandates as they do customer preferences. They have to finance electrification, and that limits the resources that they have available to give to labor. And electrification requires fewer workers. And the joint ventures now, there are 10 of them between the companies and foreign companies, tend to pay lower wages. And the Teslas and the Rivians tend to pay lower wages. So they're looking at this as what they call a race to the bottom. And they think that this is unfair. And they believe that they have a rightful place at the table to, as Walter Reuther used to say, protect their equities in the enterprise, just as shareholders and customers do. So I think that gets us back to the philosophical bridge that needs to be addressed here. You're looking at this. This is a classic struggle between labor and capital. It's just a little more militant than we've gotten used to. Labor has been pretty tame in the United States. I mean, when you think about it, 23 major strikes in a year in a workforce of 161 million. Right now, we all hear the hoopla about all these strikes, and the total number of strikers involved this year is 312,000. There are 191,000 out on strike now. And you add 13,000 with the auto workers. That is a very small number relative to the size of the workforce. And you compare that to what it was in 1970, in which you had over 300 strikes involving about 2.8 million workers. And at GM, you had over 400,000 strikers out. So I think this is when I look at it from a labor relations perspective, this reflects the weakened status of labor. And I think why labor is cornered. And it's fighting back. And I think that's why you see the UAW and you see the Teamsters and you see the pilots and the writers and the screen actors really engaging in the kinds of activities they have been recently to address what they consider to be, in their viewpoint, an untenable gap between the wealthy and the others.
John, you and I were in a meeting yesterday, and we had a senior level financial services executive say, "Hey, the auto industry seems to be the only industry where the employers and the employees go to war on a fairly regular basis. Is there something that we need to, that needs to be rethought in terms of how our the relations are between the management and labor in the auto industry?"
Look, I think that's just the nature of the beast, if you will. I mean, I don't see how you change that. And that's why I brought up the strike at ZF that's going to cripple Mercedes-Benz. The real challenge for the Detroit Three is their labor costs are significantly higher and are only going to grow even more so against companies operating in the United States, employing Americans. And that's why, in fact, I'd love to get Marick's viewpoint on this. Do you think, Marick, that the strike against ZF, which will cripple Mercedes production, is a sign of the union maybe going after the transplants? In fact, I even wonder, is the union trying to figure out a way to shut down Tesla if it possibly can? Because
yes,
go ahead.
The answer is yes. I mean, they absolutely want to make a point to the transplants that they're next, and they want a contract that they can take to the transplants. They're in what they consider to be a race to the bottom, and they've got to stop it. And that means they have to organize the transplants, they have to organize the Teslas. They've gone from close to 60% of the motor vehicle and parts industry being unionized just 1983, 40 years ago, to less than 16% today. There is a history of adversarialism, is what we call it academically in labor management relations, and manufacturing epitomizes that. There were a lot of authorized and unauthorized or wildcat strikes in the 50s and 60s and in the 40s in the transportation equipment industry and in the auto companies. It was ritual that they went on strike in the 50s and in the 60s and up to 76. You could just expect it every 3 years. And it was only when the thrust of international competition forced the shrinkage in the Detroit Three's market share that you saw a change in that equation. And in the 80s, I would add this footnote to this. In the 80s, the companies and the union engaged in joint training programs. And that sounds nice. And we're all for collaboration. Everybody says they're collaborative until push comes to shove. But that was a lousy idea. And the way it was financed, I almost think ought to be a violation of labor law, because you shouldn't have the companies giving the union money to train their own workers. They should pay for that out of their own pocket and not create a situation in which they gave both sides management of a fund that evolved essentially into social welfare programs that they used for all kinds of purposes other than to promote training, and eventually became the source of cash for both a few criminal executives and a larger number, but still a small number of criminal UAW officials. And that's why, you know, you have new leadership at the UAW now. They got complacent, they got lackadaisical, and they got the courts involved in as a result of that. So I think when now they're saying they don't want a cozy relationship, they conceded too much, that's part of what they're talking about. They went down this path of conceding things, and who knows, really, if you peel the onion, how much concessions were granted because people were being bought off.
Right.
And I think that that's the question that a lot of people have, the workers have in their mind. That's when they look at and they say, for too long they've given up too much and they haven't fought enough, and now that they're fighting back. And I think this is, you know, labor and capital. Let's remember this. They do not have identical interests. They look at the world from different perspectives and different ideologies. And it's a clash, and there will be struggle and there will be pain. That is just the nature of human affairs.
Hey, Glenn,
Marick, I got a question.
Yeah, go ahead, John,
Can I
please.
follow up? Because I love what he's bringing up here, but do you think that the UAW has a chance to organize the transplants now with this new labor situation, tight labor market? Because as you know, for 40 years, they have been spectacularly unsuccessful at organizing any of them. Do you think they have a chance now? And if so, how could they go about it?
I would say the odds are very much stacked against them. These companies are savvy, they're smart in terms of how they treat their workers. I'm not saying at all that these companies mistreat their workers or are making any inference about that. And the record is clear. The UAW has not been successful in organizing the transplants. And whatever the reasons for that might be, I think clearly one of them is that the Detroit Three are not competitive. When people talk about unionized industries, they look at job losses. I lived in Pittsburgh before I came here. I moved from Pittsburgh to here, and Pittsburgh was just climbing out of the collapse of the steel industry. And when, you know, people used to say, well, you know, we need more unions, and people would just simply say, look what happened to the steel companies. I mean, go through our town here, you know, our neighborhoods, and look at the dilapidated conditions that exist in the riverfront that was just a mess for such a long period of time. You see the same thing in the auto industry and the Rust Belt states, pockets of devastation as a result of the collapse of industry because they weren't competitive. Now, I think the lion's share of this lies in the companies for giving too much to the unions and for not being prescient enough about competing. But nonetheless, it is what it is. We're at this stage now, and it's going to be very difficult. I have yet to see, despite all the talk about union activism, any clear signs that that labor's going to turn things around.
Hey, Glenn, there was some late breaking news this morning that there might be a tentative agreement between Ford and Unifor in Canada. Let's assume that that's the case. Do you think that'll have any impact on the negotiations between the UAW on this side of the border?
Let's hope so. They're not apples to apples, the two different situations, but there are definitely similarities, and they clearly have been communicating with each other. And we'll see what happens. Marick may know the answer to this, or John, but structurally, you know, how things are in Canada from a social net standpoint is different than we are here. But I do think it's optimism, or cause for optimism.
And Glenn, when you look at the local media and they're covering, the picket lines at the targeted plants, talk to us about the impact downstream, the unseen impact of these work stoppages, especially through the supplier base, which I know you know so well.
Right. Well, I've talked to a lot of them, like all of you have, and talked to a couple last night. Unfortunately, particularly the ones that supply the three plants and the ones that have had some ancillary shutdowns because of components that come from those plants that have been struck, suppliers are already laying people off. You saw 650 people in Detroit laid off yesterday. But this is also affecting salaried workforce. People are having to forego Fridays, having to forego weeks off right now because they have already lost revenue. And the other thing is that, they're basically held hostage. I mean, that's a strong word to use, but that's a word that one of the executives used with me, is that they have they have all the stakes in the game and they are innocent bystanders right now. And as things roll, if they don't progress, this is why we have to have an agreement. And the multiplier effect of these jobs, it can get real devastating real quick. And the last thing I'd say is, once you lose the labor that you've had to lay off or maybe even terminate, good luck getting it back in this labor market. And that is probably one of the bigger fears too, aside from lost revenue and financial stress.
Oh, you're muted, Sandy.
Thank you, John. Even when we got 300 people on the call, I'm still muted. Hey, John, one of the questions I get from reporters is, well, gee, the auto industry seems so healthy right now. Why is there such concern about the supply base? Especially the tier twos and tier threes. What are the different dynamics of, the smaller suppliers compared to, say, the OEMs?
Sure. Well, look, over the last 3 years, first because of the COVID shutdowns, then the chip shortage. I don't have the exact number, but over the last 3 years, the U.S. has probably built somewhere close to 6 to 8 million fewer vehicles than it would have. Now, the automakers did okay because once supply was constrained, prices went up. Dealers made out like bandits. They've just come off the best 3 years that they've ever had ever. Suppliers, not so. They lost volume. They were not able to recoup it in pricing. And so they're severely stressed. And when you get down to the twos and threes, the tier twos and threes, these are small companies, many of them. And in many cases, they have one customer, one of the automakers. And in a lot of cases, they have contracts with one model. They make, I'll make up an example, door handles for the F-150. And so these companies are in desperate trouble. Many of them, Lori Harbor from Harbor Results calls them unbankable. They cannot even go to the bank and get loans to keep their operations going. And when they go down, this is going to be a huge mess. I mean, if you think there's problems with people getting laid off and finding other work, once those companies are gone and collapse, I don't know what's going to happen. So it's entirely possible we see a strike get settled weeks down the road and the industry can't get going again because these suppliers are out of business. And guess what? It goes beyond the tier twos and threes. I was talking with an executive at a tier one supplier. This is a gigantic, one of the top 5 suppliers in the world, multinational, multi-billion, very solid balance sheet. They're thinking of maybe they're going to have to furlough workers because they don't have cash, not enough cash. They have to preserve their cash. And they don't know how long the strike is going to go. I mean, if you work out the numbers, and Marick will probably know this far better than I do, this strike could go to Christmas before the union depletes its strike fund. It could even go longer than that. And if this thing goes on for several months, it's going to be 2 torpedoes below the waterline for the Detroit auto industry.
And the region and the state, not just the industry.
No, that's exactly right. Glenn mentioned all these layoffs that are coming. I mean, the governors of the states have got to be worried deeply about how much more they're going to have to pay out in unemployment right now. And it's unclear whether some of the striking work or the workers who are getting laid off because of the strike that work at the car companies are going to get unemployment. But definitely the collateral damage to suppliers, it's going to cause layoffs that are going to show a huge spike in unemployment claims.
So let's be a little hypothetical here, and Professor Masters, we'll start with you. Let's say that the Detroit 3 automakers were to agree generally to what the UAW demands are. Can you walk us through, and I'm going to ask everyone the same question, can you walk us through kind of what the downstream implications are of agreeing to what the demands are in terms of their profitability, their market share, their global positioning, their ability to invest in either AV or EV, technology going forward?
Well, it's estimated that labor is about 5 to 10% of the cost of operating the companies, and that their demands would double more than double the hourly cost of the workforce. So they would be forced to pass that increase on to customers or cut other expenses or absorb it, which would reduce their profitability. I did a back of the envelope calculation about what it would cost Ford just to give workers a 30% increase compounded and a holiday and $18,000 in inflation protection and ratification bonuses. And that comes to about $2.5 billion for over the life of the contract. Now, when you look at their revenues, they're expected to get, the three companies of this year, about $560 billion in revenue. And you can say, well, that's affordable. But these costs are going to eat into profits, and that's a minor part of their overall package. The real budget busters are the retirement and the work week and the COLA. I think if they were to give that, plus they give the wage increases on top of the COLA, which compounds, then they're putting themselves in a real disadvantage. And I think what you're going to see is that they're going to have to substitute capital for labor. They're going to have to find ways of being more efficient. Elon Musk has already talked about reducing the cost of production by 50%. And he is experimenting, I know John has talked about this, with new technologies to assemble vehicles in Mexico that I think they can be replicated elsewhere. So they're looking very much at reducing the cost of production and the profit margins that they can get from vehicles. So if they were to suffer a long strike that puts them back, raises their cost, they're inviting to be acquired by another company or to force themselves ultimately into bankruptcy because their costs are unsustainable. I don't see how they go back to where they were and have any future ahead of them. And I think Stellantis is in a better position in many ways than the others, but just one of the reasons being it's less dependent on North America, but it's telegraphed that it's going to restructure.
Glenn, I'm sorry, please.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, Glenn, I want to get your thoughts on this too.
Yeah, I mean, just to pick up on a couple of things there. Let's say hypothetically it does go to that. I mean, what I worry about, and you all know me and my focus, and it's not exclusively on Michigan, but that's why I do what I do and why MICHauto and our team does what we do. I worry about what the long-term situation here is in Michigan. And I'm not just talking about manufacturing, because as Marick points out, that cost absorption has to come out of somewhere. Well, I don't think it's going to come out of the supply base, because I don't think they've got much more to give. And then you look at what's the other operating overhead of my company and how do I cut that? We already know that they have outsourced engineering and software development to Mexico and to other countries. And I don't even want to picture or imagine the Detroit 3 having less of an engineering presence and a research and a development and testing presence in Michigan, because that would be a real disaster. And that's something they have to guard against. So we come back to where the OEMs are. They put substantial offers on the table. They're spending more money on R&D and electrification than they are on the profits they make. And they have to be able to compete. And otherwise they'll lose market share, and they'll have to be forced to do things which I don't think we want to think about, which would impact our economy here in Michigan.
John, when you and I were growing up, the big four at the time, really ruled the automotive industry. And today, General Motors is only the fifth largest automaker in the world. Talk to us about, the competition. I mean, I think those of us who live in Michigan think of Ford versus General Motors versus GM / Stellantis. Talk to us about what the global environment is today in the automotive mobility space.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, you've got to look at not just what's going on in the United States. You've got to look at it on a global basis. GM and Ford compete globally, and they're not doing a very good job of it either right now. But But getting back to your other thing, what would happen? Remember, three key elements, in my opinion, are what helped drive the big three into bankruptcy during the Great Recession. And that was pensions, healthcare, and the jobs bank. Those were essentially fixed costs. So when the market cratered, the sales of cars and trucks cratered in 2008 and 2009, they couldn't cut their costs. I mean, they were locked into those things. And then when the credit markets froze up, they couldn't borrow the money to keep going. Ford had fortunately borrowed enough money ahead of that. But if Sean Fain wants to restore those things, plus a 32-hour work week, 4-day work week, this could likely be the last contract he ever signs with the Detroit Three. They may not be around in 4 years after this. Or to Marick's point, they may be owned by somebody else at that point. That's how critical this is. And so if he truly is pushing for that and thinks he can get it, it will be a Pyrrhic victory. He'll win the battle but lose the war.
Yeah, I heard Steve Ratner use a variation of your quote yesterday in a column. Be careful you don't kill the golden goose. And John, you said that with on Flashpoint the other day, and that's a fear.
So, Professor Masters, one of the things that actually shows up in the Q&A chat here is regarding kind of absenteeism in the factories. And it used to be with the job banks, that kind of behavior was supported kind of after the Great Recession and things got restructured, that kind of minimized. Do you see the risk of that kind of, I think what you called it, social programming coming back with these potential new contracts?
Well, I think there's always that risk, but I would say that Stellantis impressed me with its initial proposals and the detail with which they addressed operational issues. And I would commend Stellantis and its COO for how they've conducted this, because they haven't tried to sugarcoat anything. They've been open about their need to remain competitive and to restructure and to continue to do business, even in the midst of these negotiations and initial strike. So I think they're facing the hard realities right dead center, and that's the way it should be from a business point of view. I would simply say that I think that John made an excellent point that I'd like to piggyback up on, is that I don't know why anybody would want to buy a couple of these auto companies if they had to absorb their cost structure and couldn't get out of them. And I think that bankruptcy may be a better option in which they can sell off the parts. But I look at it this way, that if labor keeps on pushing for this and goes into a full-scale strike, Glenn mentioned the impact on Michigan. A 4-week strike would cost more than 150,000 jobs in Michigan alone. And you can double that over 8 weeks. And the companies are going to lose $500 million a week each. And personal income, in a 4-week strike across all three companies would go down in the United States over $1 billion. So you're going to see a tremendous hit. And I noticed a poll that came out this morning that said that 58% of the public supported the UAW. What struck me is how small that was. Because trust me, that is weak support. That isn't 58% that will support the UAW regardless of what it does. And if they go into a strike that forces hundreds, tens of thousands of people in Michigan to lose their jobs, hundreds of thousands in the United States, cripples the companies, destroys their competitiveness, then I think public opinion will turn sharply against the UAW. And I know it's a test of leadership and everything, but leadership sometimes means not doing everything the membership wants you to do.
John, what about the political leadership? The White House, members of Congress, the governor. What role do you see them playing, either positive or negatively, in all this?
Well, I think Marick just set that up perfectly. Look, reportedly, President Biden was going to come out and stand with the people on strike. And now we're reading that he's not going to do that. And I think it's exactly for the reasons that Marick just cited there. What if this turns out to be a long strike? What if hundreds of thousands of innocent bystanders, so to speak, people not with the union, start losing their jobs? What if unemployment payouts tend to skyrocket here? I mean, you've already seen Governor Whitmer come out and she didn't take sides with either. She just wants to see this thing get resolved, is what she's saying publicly. And if it starts to really get ugly and starts damaging the livelihoods of other people who have nothing to do with the union, you bet that's going to turn into a political voice. And it'll be interesting to see who wants to stand up and exploit that opportunity politically.
Glenn, it looks like you want to jump in.
Yeah, I got a call from one of the legislative leaders earlier this week in the morning, a very thoughtful, strong leader. And what this person wanted to know was, what are the ramifications? Like, what is going on in the supply base? What happens in the communities? And I just thought it was a very balanced approach. Obviously, politics are extremely involved here. Some people grandstand, some people, just keep a low profile. But what we're trying to do is keep people's understanding of how big, and Marick just walked through the numbers. I mean, the impact of something that keeps rolling. I mean, tell the person right now who just gave up a week of pay, how do they feel right now? And that is in the early stages of something. So, all we can hope is that there's good signals coming and that they can get to a resolution, because look, we have to compete for the future. Detroit and Michigan have to compete for the future. And we're not in the bubble that we were decades ago. We are on a global stage. GM sells more cars and trucks in China than they do in North America.
So what do you all think about the ripple effect? There's 7 to 10 jobs tied to each OEM job. John, one of the things that we really haven't talked much about are like repair shops and dealers. How are they impacted through not just the strike today, but potentially, the ripple effects post post agreement?
Well, I think they'll be more affected by the strike than after, because right now service parts are under threat of being manufactured and or delivered. Because one of the things the union has talked about is striking down parts depots. So, and what Ford has tried to do is get white collar people trained to go in and operate those warehouses that would keep spare parts going to police departments, fire departments, ambulances, and things like that. But the ripple effect, I think, will turn more and more people against the UAW, as people who right now may support it, but once it impacts their job and their livelihoods, are no longer going to support the UAW.
Yeah, the long-term implications of, the competitiveness of, our Detroit 3 companies has a direct impact on our local communities and our long-term economic health. We're wrapping up in time here. I want to give each of you kind of a chance, whatever we may have missed in this conversation. Glenn, let's start with you for kind of your closing thoughts.
Yeah, the one thing that's been on my mind is kind of the bitter irony of what we're experiencing right now. Here we are coming out of a pandemic, all the things we've been through, and we've seen a movement of reshoring, of onshoring, of the ability of American manufacturing to, kind of reassert itself. The government's invested in it with CHIPS Act and things like that. And we can't shoot ourselves in the foot by a disagreement or a battle that takes us off our ability to capitalize on this moment in global history too. So again, I say it over and over, but I'm just hopeful that they get a resolution and that labor and management, labor in these companies continue to build and compete for the future and build our industry here.
Professor Masters?
Well, what's impressed me least about these negotiations is how uncreative and unoriginal they are, and that how much people just want to go back to the past and repeat the mistakes of the past there's a lot of money out there and a lot of money that can be shared with workers. And I think that's the important point to remember. And they just need to buckle down and find a way to do it. And if they did that, they could come to an agreement, I think, pretty quickly. And also, I would just underscore one thing. A lot of things happen at the workplace day to day, which create bad feelings. And I started a YouTube channel and sent out an update on the auto workers strike and got an email from somebody who said to me, no, or a comment said, you forgot about all the big issue, the fans, the microwaves, and the toilets. And then he said back seriously, he said, we have fights over the lack of toilets and the microwaves. And I think, a lot of time what workers are saying is that in terms of scheduling, in terms of how they're treated day to day, in terms of how they are made feel part of a team, a family, if you will, they don't feel that way. And so I think there's a lot that could be done on a daily basis to make the lives of these workers better, that would make them feel better. And I think that also that if both sides would put aside the past and the ideology that's driving the behavior right now, they could put a lot more money in workers' pocketbooks and make them better off.
I just want to acknowledge in the Q&A chat section, there's a couple comments about, increased profit sharing, use of options, like some of the startups are doing. So I just want to acknowledge that those comments have come through. John McElroy of Autoline, you get the last word here.
Okay, I'm just going to echo what Marick said there. He's right. Little things like that, the bathrooms, the food in the cafeteria, that can help reduce absenteeism right there. Make the workplace a cool place to go to. But my final thought is this. I worry as to whether Shawn Fain gets the big picture. He's very focused on what his members want and what he wants to deliver to them. What about this move to electrification? This is threatening to the automakers. What about the transplants and the startups and competing against them? Does he really, take that into account as to what he's asking for? And if he is going to ignore those things and the collateral damage of everybody getting laid off because of the ripple effect, if he doesn't care about that, I mean, this is the guy that's been railing against corporate greed. I would argue if you're going to ignore all those other things, that's just as greedy as the people that you're attacking. And that's why I worry and I wonder if he really gets the big picture.
Well, certainly when it comes to EVs, it seems to me that the union leadership is defending the 8-track tape player and the fax machine with the EV sales, up 67% year over year. And we're at, almost 9% of new car sales. And the U.S. is by far not the leader in EV adoption, but it's certainly coming. Well, Professor Masters, John McElroy of Autoline, Glenn Stevens of MICHauto, thank you, gentlemen, all three of you, very much for a really insightful conversation. And for all of you who have joined us, taking time out of your busy day to join the Detroit Regional Chamber and MICHauto today for this conversation, thank you and have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Good seeing
Thanks,
everybody.
guys. Great stuff. Thank you. Take care, everyone.